Welcome, everyone. So glad to see you here today, and just want to thank you for your witness. It's not easy to witness to people who are very, very deceived, but we're called to do that and to do so in love, but also in truth and telling people what's true. So we need to continue to do that. We need to be in prayer for a lot of people, especially in Israel right now and other places in the world that are having people attacked. It's good to be praying for persecuted Christians around the world. But today we're going to continue on in our study of Esther. It's Esther 7:1 through 8:8. And the title is The Villain Exposed. In our last lesson, we learned how Haman had a gallows made on which to execute Mordecai. But on the very night that the gallows was being constructed, King Ahasuerus couldn't sleep. When he called for the king's chronicles to be read to him, he discovered that Mordecai had never been rewarded for uncovering the plot to assassinate the king. Just when Haman entered the palace in the morning to ask that Mordecai be executed that day, the king was looking for someone with good suggestions about how to honor a person who pleased the king. Thinking he was the one the king wanted to honor, Haman made a lot of good suggestions. Then he was hit by the bombshell. Ahasuerus wanted him to do all these wonderful things for his enemy, Mordecai. After he spent the day parading around the streets to honor Mordecai, Haman went home, bowed down with grief. His wife and advisors recognized something miraculous in the way God had intervened on behalf of Mordecai. So they told Haman that since he had tangled with Mordecai, a Jew, he had begun his downfall and would surely come to ruin. In a matter of hours, Haman's ruin came upon him. Let's read Esther 7:1 through 7. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. The king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine at the banquet, "What is your request, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your wish? Up to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my request, and my people as my wish, for we have been sold. I and my people to be destroyed, killed, and eliminated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have kept silent, because the distress would not be sufficient reason to burden the king." Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? And who would presume to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king then got up in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. King Xerxes and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther for the second time. Why had she waited and not informed the king the day before? Well, I believe the Holy Spirit led her to wait so that Haman would build his gallows, the king would read the chronicles and find Mordecai's name, and Haman could be humbled by honoring Mordecai. Esther was wise because God gave her the wisdom to wait for his appointed time when everything would be arranged the way he wanted it. The king must have been curious at this time. What was this special request of Esther? Why hadn't she told him yet? As they were relaxing and drinking wine, he asked her for the third time to reveal her petition. Again, he repeated that he would grant her request up to half his kingdom. Finally, Esther knew that the time was right. She answered the king politely and with respect, but with a straightforward and honest answer. She said that her petition was to ask for her life, and her request was to spare the lives of her people. She went on to explain that she and her people had been sold for destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. Evidently, the king had forgotten the permission he'd given to Haman to kill the Jews. Of course, when he agreed to Haman's request, he didn't know that his beloved queen was a Jew, nor did he know that the man he had honored, Mordecai, was also a Jew. At the time that he had agreed to destroy all Jews in the kingdom, he thought of them only as faceless enemies. Suddenly, they were the people closest to him. Esther told the king that if they were only to be sold as male and female slaves, she would have kept quiet. That distress would not have justified disturbing the king, as if it were a small thing to be sold as slaves. But even if they had to endure slavery, at least they would have their lives. King Xerxes was furious. He asked, "Where is he? Where is the man who dared to do such a thing?" Esther didn't hesitate to identify him. The time had come. She said, the adversary and enemy is that this vile Haman." Needless to say, Haman was terrified in the presence of the king and queen. Suddenly he realized he was not a favorite at all. He'd been invited to the banquet to be revealed and condemned. He had no idea that the hated Jews had a representative in high places. Too late, Haman recognized that Esther was a Jew. The king's favorite was one of those he had condemned. King Ahasuerus got up in a rage and left his wine to go out into the palace garden. I think it finally dawned on him how Haman had deceived him into believing that all Jews were seditious and his enemies. I think he was so full of rage that he had to get out of the banquet hall lest he kill Haman with his own hands, which would be an unkingly thing to do. Meanwhile, Haman knew from the king's fury that his fate was sealed. So he stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. My, how the tables had turned. All of Haman's dreams and plans had come crashing down around his feet. No doubt he remembered the words of his wife and advisers that since Mordecai was a Jew, Haman would be brought to ruin. He had no idea that the Jews are God's precious chosen people, and those who touch his beloved ones will die for it sooner or later and eternally. Something for a lot of people to remember today. Let's go on to read Esther 7, 8 through 10. Now, when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they had been drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who stood before the king, said, "Indeed, behold the wooden gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good in behalf of the king." And the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the wooden gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Out in the garden, the king had no doubt feeling somehow ashamed and foolish as he remembered how easily Haman had fooled him into making a careless mistake involving the lives of thousands of people. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. No doubt he was planning the best way to get rid of this deceiving man. His anger boiled over when he came back into the room and saw Haman falling on the couch where Queen Esther was sitting. Haman was begging her for mercy, but the king, in his anger, misread Haman's intentions. He said, "Will you even molest the queen while she's with me in the house?" He may have thought that Haman, being a Jew hater, wanted to harm the queen for revealing his evil intentions. The minute King Ahasuerus exclaimed these angry, accusing words, the servant standing by covered Haman's face, a sign that he was condemned to death. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, gave him some more interesting information about Haman. Harbona told King Ahasuerus there was a 75-foot gallows standing by Haman's house. The king must have wondered why Haman had such a big gallows. Harbona explained that Haman had built the gallows for Mordecai to hang on, the man whom the king had just honored because of his patriotism and faithfulness in saving the king's life. That did not make the king any happier. He was now more furious than ever. We read in Proverbs 20:22, the terror of a king is like the roaring of a lion. One who provokes him to anger forfeits his own life. Well, he also knew now the best way to get rid of this deceiving, scheming anti-Semite. He said, hang him on it. So they took Haman and hung him on the gallows he had built for Mordecai. We read in Psalm 7:14 through 16, behold, an evil person is pregnant with injustice, and he conceives harm and gives birth to lies. He has dug a pit and hollowed it out, and has fallen into the hole which he made. His harm will return on his own head, and his violence will descend on the top of his own head. So true. Haman's body hung far up in the air where everybody could see what happens to those who plan to harm God's people. And so God's justice was meted out. Finally, with Haman hanging on the gallows, getting his just punishment, the king's anger subsided. This is just a small taste of the way the Lord will turn the tables at the return of Christ, when the persecuted Jews and Christians will be elevated to places of authority, while the evil persecutors are destroyed the way they wanted to destroy God's people. Let's go on to Esther 8, 1 through 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to King Esther. And Mordecai came before the king because Esther had disclosed what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king, fell at his feet, wept, and pleaded for his compassion to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. And the king extended the golden scepter to Esther. So Esther got up and stood before the king. Then she said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I'm pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to eliminate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the disaster which will happen to my people? And how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I've given the house of Haman to Esther, and they've hanged him on the wooden gallows because he had reached out with his hand against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. The same day that the king had discovered Haman's treachery and had him hanged, he gave Haman's estate to Esther. This is what Haman had been boasting about to his wife and friends. As they'd predicted, tangling with God's people had brought him to complete ruin and death. Mordecai then came to the king's presence because Esther had told King Ahasuerus that she and Mordecai were related. Mordecai was then elevated to take Haman's place. Mordecai's wisdom, patience, and faithfulness and trust in the Lord finally paid off. The king took his signet ring, which he'd taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. This automatically gave Mordecai the position and authority in the kingdom that Haman had had. Queen Esther then appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's estate. In Proverbs 13:22 we read, "A good person leaves an inheritance to his grandchildren, and the wealth of a sinner is stored up for the righteous." Mordecai ended up with Haman's royal position and his estate, while Haman ended up losing everything and and on his own gallows. In one swift move, God, the poor man sitting at the king's gate, became uh, a very rich and influential man. Proverbs 10:28 says, "The hope of the righteous is gladness, but the expectation of the wicked perishes. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, nor crush the needy at the gate." And Proverbs 22:22 through 23 says, "For the Lord will plead their case and take the life of those who rob them." But Esther's work wasn't finished. Haman was done away with, but his edict still stood. Esther was not just concerned with her safety or was seeking revenge on her enemy. His purpose was to save her people. So once again, she fell at the feet of the king, weeping and begging him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman. The problem was that the edict had been approved by the king and it still stood. It could not be changed because it was part of the law of the Medes and Persians. That could not be changed or revised. King Ahasuerus extended his gold scepter to Esther as he had done before, indicating that he would grant her petition. Proverbs 21:1 and 2 says, "The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he pleases. Every person's way is right in his own eyes, but the Lord examines the hearts." She arose and stood before him. Esther spoke very respectfully. She said, "If it pleases the king, if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, if he is pleased with me." Esther knew that though she was queen, she was asking a big favor from the king. She dared to ask because she knew the king found pleasure in her. After all, he had signed and sent out the edict. It would not be good to be critical of him. Esther didn't ask the king to reverse or ignore his own laws. He couldn't change the decree that he had allowed Haman to send out because it would be unjust under the law of the Medes and Persians. You remember from Daniel that a similar thing happened. Daniel 6:8 says, "Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it will not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." Also, verse 12, "Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any person who offers a prayer to any god or person besides you, O Lord, for 30 days is to be thrown into the lion's den?" The king replied, "The statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked." And also verse 15, "Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, 'Recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed.'" Instead, Esther asked him to overrule the decree. He could write a higher law that would change the situations of the Jews from victims to victors. Esther appealed to his sympathy, saying, "How can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" It's interesting that she didn't beg for her own life, even though as a Jew, she too could die. King Xerxes spoke with Esther and Mordecai, who was now close as an advisor to the king. The king reviewed what he had already done to right the situation. Because Haman had attacked the Jews, the king already acted on their behalf. He had given Haman's estate to Esther and had him hanged on the gallows. King Xerxes then told Esther and Mordecai to write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews. He told them to write whatever seemed best. Then they could seal it with the king's signet ring. That was amazing. He gave Esther and Mordecai permission to write whatever they wanted on behalf of the Jews. I think one reason why he was so generous and magnanimous was that he felt guilty for going along with Haman's scheme without even checking it out with others. The book of Esther teaches us in a wonderful way how God can change a seemingly impossible situation by turning the tables on evil and elevating his beloved ones. Sometimes when something looks like it's the absolute end, it's actually the beginning. We may not recognize it right away, but later on, we'll see how God worked for us in answer to our heartfelt prayers. Think about the cross. Jesus' followers were sure that all was lost when he was put into the tomb. The Romans applauded and the Jewish officials rejoiced. But 3 days later, he was alive again. What seemed like an ending was only the beginning. When the seminary professor thought the maintenance man surely couldn't understand the book of Revelation that he was reading, the simple Christian brother said, "I understand it. God wins." Let's never forget that in the end, God wins. And when we're on his side, we win too. Well, we got to that point anyway, and we have a lot further to go, but wow, what a story. And how appropriate can it be for today? Let's see. Let me bring up the gallery so I can see everybody. There we go.